It's good to see so many of you from so many different countries. My name is Miranda Hamilton. I am a consultant for Cambridge English Language Assessment on their Learning Oriented Assessment project. Welcome to our webinar today on Learning Oriented Assessment. To start, I'd like to give you some information about Cambridge Assessment. Cambridge Assessment was established 150 years ago. We're an international exams group and a not-for-profit organisation. We're a department of Cambridge University comprising 3 exam boards as well as the largest research capability of its kind. We advise governments and NGOs and we partner industry leaders to deliver the best products and services. As well as submitting papers to refereed academic journals and making presentations at conferences, seminars and symposia, we share our experience and research findings with the wider language assessment community through our own publications. One of these publications is Studies in Language Teaching, SILT, a series of academic volumes published jointly by Cambridge English Language Assessment and Cambridge University Press. The series examines important issues and new developments in language testing that are relevant to test users, developers and researchers. You can order SILT from the CUP website or from any good bookseller. As you can see from the map, Cambridge English Language Assessment has around 4 million candidates from all over the world. There are over 2,700 centres in 130 countries with approximately 20,000 examiners. The aim of this webinar is to provide a brief introduction to the topic of learning-oriented assessment and to invite you to reflect and bring your own experience and knowledge to this important area of language development. In the webinar, we'll explore the concepts of summative assessment and formative assessment, the difficulties which surround this distinction. We'll then look at how learning-oriented assessment places learning back at the centre of assessment by exploring how it works and ways in which it links different types of assessment in an integrated way. We'll also look at how learning-oriented assessment works in the classroom and how it can help your teaching and your students' learning. Learning-oriented assessment is the new label in the discourse of assessment. When I was first invited to explore the concepts underpinning LOA, the comment that kept coming back to me was, "So LOA, that's a kind of formative assessment, isn't it?" And it occurred to me that friends and colleagues were building meaning from the term learning-oriented assessment, attempting to locate LOA alongside 2 popular concepts in assessment, summative assessment and formative assessment. So let's start by unpacking these 2 concepts slightly, since they serve as our conceptual touchstone about assessment. Then I'll propose the possibility that we may be restricting our thinking by locating concepts of assessment into either the formative or summative camp and show how learning-oriented assessment fits. So, what do you understand by the term formative assessment? I'd like you to type your answers into the chat box to the left of the screen. Can you write any ideas that you think can be included under the term formative assessment? Let's see what ideas you come up with. Ongoing assessment, okay. Ongoing is another word that comes up. Ongoing evaluation, showing progress, integrated input. Some really, really good ideas there that I'd like to examine in a bit more detail later. That's great. So let's have a look at some statements about formative assessment. Now, as many of you pointed out, formative assessment takes place during a course of study, ongoing assessment. Teachers adapt the learning programme according to the needs of the learners in response to identified learning objectives. I have another task for you to do now. Here we have a number of different ways in which teachers might check their learners' progress and development. Let's take a look at them now, and then I'd like you to decide which one is most appropriate for you. So let's take a look at them. A, observing learners during the speaking activity, identifying points for further development. Or maybe for you, B, setting regular progress tests and noting down learners' mistakes in a writing activity to do further work on in class. But it could be described as formative assessment is because the teacher is taking note of how learners are doing and using this to inform teaching and the decisions about what takes place in the classroom and for homework. In fact, some of these, such as A, the classroom speaking activity, or D, the classroom listening activity, could be described as incidental formative assessment, because in these examples, the teacher is responding to the learner as events take place in the classroom, heavily reliant on teacher intuition. So the danger is that it can be a bit hit and miss. B, setting regular progress tests, or C, a writing task, could be described as planned formative assessment because we develop a test or a task, a writing task, to check what the learner knows. We elicit how well the learner can manipulate the structures that have been taught. We might tag this as summative assessment used formatively. The notion of formative assessment therefore has very clear pedagogical appeal. As teachers, we notice, we respond to, we plan around what our students can do now, what we anticipate they're capable of achieving in the future, and how they might arrive at that point. And then, at a moment's notice, we skillfully adapt our teaching plans to optimise opportunities for learning for our students. Formative assessment is identified as a highly qualitative process because it seems to be based on the rich intuitions of teachers. But with its focus on interaction, support and development, the formative view of assessment seems to be incongruous with the summative view. In fact, many claim that it's just teaching because it lacks the reliability and validity of summative assessment. So let's have a look now at what is meant by summative assessment. Again, could you type into the chat box examples of summative assessment and let's see what some of those comments are. Let's take a look. So, wants assessment, end of course test, tasks. Somebody has no idea, IELTS, okay, summative tests, entry tests. In fact, that's great, a wide range of options you've given us there. In fact, yes, summative assessment can be identified as end-of-term tests, end-of-year school exams, Cambridge English exams, national exams or qualifications. Those are some of the examples we came up with. So, summative assessment occurs at the end of a period of study, whether it's in the form of small-scale classroom tests, which are more individualised to the small cohort of student, but these have a reduced level of reliability and validity, or large-scale standardised, high-stakes external exams, which have a high degree of reliability and validity, but with reduced levels of individualisation for your learners. Summative assessment captures where the learner is now and what the learner can do in terms of the test performance. But in fact, in isolation, summative assessment could be seen as a restrictive view of ability and proficiency because the outcomes are defined by the task types and the content embedded within the test and what's been taught in the learning programme. So it doesn't capture what else the learner knows. Summative and formative assessment are traditional delineations, And they're very useful for teachers and students because they carve out an identity for different approaches to assessment so that we all know what we're doing, when and why. However, the distinction oversimplifies formative and summative assessment, and there is a tendency to see them as separate entities. But as we've already seen with the example of the progress test, summative assessment can be used formatively. One could then argue that they're not opposing ideas at all. Instead, they sit on a spectrum. But if they're on a spectrum, this means that formative assessment and summative assessment is not comparable because they are in fact two sides of the same coin. The real problem is that they are imprecise terms, so the discussion becomes confusing. The two distinctions are really problematic, and they've been disputed for over 30 years in the theoretical literature. Indeed, is the formative-summative distinction meaningful at all? The distinction can be described as spurious, and there therefore is a need for greater clarity. So instead of focusing on the nature of the assessment, we need to think about the purpose and the use to which the assessment is put. It can be argued that summative assessment is a kind of judgment, and formative assessment is a kind of purpose. The formative purpose of assessment is to promote continued progress of the student, where decisions are then made about the next course of action and processes are implemented to support the next phase of learning. So whatever form the assessment takes, whether it's small-scale, classroom-based or large-scale standardised assessment, what we come back to every time is the sense that learning is central to assessment. An assessment impacts upon learning outcomes. This idea is supported in the literature, and I'll give you some references for further reading at the end of this webinar, in case you'd like to follow up these sources. What emerges, however, is the challenge of assessment, because it has to serve double duty. It is about grading just as it is about learning. It is about standardisation just as it is about individualisation. But it has to be principled and practical to implement. Learning lies at the heart of assessment, but in light of the difficulties associated with discriminating between different forms of assessment, the need emerges for a new term. Learning-oriented assessment captures the centrality of learning within assessment, and so reconciles the problem we have with the two terms formative and summative assessment, because, as David Carlos says, with learning-oriented assessment, the learning comes first, both in the way the term is literally constructed and as a matter of principle of emphasising the learning aspects of assessment. But to achieve this, by necessity, learning-oriented assessment involves the collection and interpretation of evidence about performance, so that judgments can be made about further language development. So let's have a look then at how this might work in practice in the classroom. We start by specifying our objectives against the Common European Framework. Let's say you're teaching a class who's working towards A2 level. So you'll use the A2 level descriptors to draw up your learning objectives for your course or syllabus. The course or syllabus is then delivered into the classroom. The language teacher identifies a task or language activity that's designed to help the learners to work towards one of the learning objectives. For example, the use of the past simple and present perfect. The learners carry out the task in class, and Meanwhile, the teacher monitors the activity and observes how the learners are performing. The teacher interprets the learner's responses and picks up, for example, that learner A has not conceptualised the distinction in meaning between the past simple and the present perfect. So concept checks in class. It then becomes apparent that learner B has conceptually grasped the difference, but in practice is inconsistent in selecting the correct form and tense. Not only that, the teacher will also note the learner's achievements. So learner C is starting to use the present perfect and past simple with a degree of consistency. As the teacher monitors, he or she makes an informal mental record or quick note about the student's task performance and their achievements in the lesson. Based on these observations and informal records of student performance, the teacher makes a decision about the next course of action. Now, this could include giving learners feedback on their performance and their progress, but it could also mean modifying the immediate learning objectives to optimise learning outcomes for this task. The teacher then uses these classroom observations and informal records to inform the next task. And so the familiar pedagogical cycle continues. As well as this informal record during the activity, after the lesson, the teacher may also keep a more structured record with information about the content and activities covered in class, the progress the students have made, and the difficulties they may have encountered. In practice, LOA means that the learner's performance is therefore monitored throughout the lesson, the week, the course, and may well conclude with a final summative exam, such as Cambridge English KET, KET for schools, or the Young Flyers exam suite. So, learning-oriented assessment therefore has the potential to help multiple stakeholders because we can collect and interpret evidence about performance, enabling us to make informed decisions about further language development. The evaluation of our learners' progress against course and lesson and task objectives, whether it's at the level of school management or the level of the classroom and individual learners, provides us with a roadmap for everyone to work towards, which has a transparency of purpose. This may be for teachers through the provision of clear curricular objectives, timely feedback on learner understanding. For learners who can work at the right level, receive relevant and timely feedback, encouraging them to become independent learners. And for schools and parents who can monitor progress towards targets so that their students and their children can achieve valid, reliable and recognised certification. You can see that for LOA it's important to collect evidence from the classroom and to maintain a record of learners' achievements and progress, because this information is used to inform student feedback, subsequent learning tasks, inform the next lesson, and to help the teacher decide about when to administer a classroom test. How can teachers collect the kinds of evidence they need about learning from their students? Can you type your ideas about how they might achieve this into the chat box now? So, how can teachers collect the kind of evidence they need about learning from their students? Let me just see some of those ideas as they're coming through. Okay, a pop quiz, yes. Oral performance, okay. Writing, end of unit tests, yes. Presentations, okay. Personal data, speaking, role play, file cards. Really, really interesting ideas as they're coming through there. So thank you for that, and we'll take a closer look later. That's really great. Let's explore this a bit further. I'd like to begin by looking also at how we can use tests as a means of collecting evidence about learning. In fact, some of you mentioned testing just there. So, thinking about the test How regularly do you think it's helpful for the teacher to test the students in the classroom? Let's take a look at the slide here. So A, for you, maybe after every unit it's helpful, halfway through the course book, the end of the course book, when the teacher thinks the students are ready to be tested, or possibly never. Can you press your polling buttons and select for you which do you think is the most helpful? Let's see. I can see some D's when you think when the teacher makes the judgment. Okay, A, D. Click the polling buttons and we can see what the statistics look like here. A. Okay, let's take a look. So we've got, let's see. A seems to be popular, 27%, but quite a spread there. 17% say D when the teacher thinks it's the most helpful. So that's a very interesting finding there, so thank you. So now let's take a look at the next question. What kind of testing materials do you, as teachers, use in the classroom? Let's take a look at the options here on the slide. Maybe as teachers, if you're using testing materials with your students, you're using published tests, option A, or tests you develop yourself. Maybe your institution, C, provides the tests. Perhaps you never use tests or none of the above. Can you press your polling buttons to tell us the types of tests you tend to use? I'm reading lots here. A, B and C. A, B and C. Sometimes A. Okay. A and B. B, tests you develop yourself. Okay. That's really interesting. I'll be interested to see what the data, how it comes out in just a moment. Okay, so let's take a look. A combination, it seems, between A, which is published tests, and B, which is tests you develop yourself. So yes, that's really interesting. But having collected the test, having conducted the test, marked the test, what happens next? In fact, classroom tests generate information about our learners' progress. But what happens with this information? How do teachers use this data? Let's take a look at the following options on the screen now, which I'll just go through quickly. And in a moment, I'd like you to click your polling buttons to indicate how you would be most likely to use those. So let's look at the slide. So, would you, after the test, give feedback to the whole class and recommend practice activities, option A? Maybe B, give feedback to students individually and recommend practice activities to help them improve. Or C, use information from test scores to help you decide what to teach next. Perhaps after the test, D, you don't direct students to practice activities based on their test performance. Or maybe you think E, classroom test scores make little difference to the decisions you make about what to teach or reteach. Let's take a look at some of those findings as they're coming through. I've clicked B, but you really mean A and B. Okay, we've picked that up, thank you. B and C, test scores help you teach next, so it's pedagogical as well as helping individual students. That's very, very interesting indeed. So from the way you voted, it seems that assessment data is used as a useful source of information that's used to inform whole class or individual feedback and as a means of informing your lesson planning. Classroom tests as an approach to classroom assessment and LOA are not the entire story though. I want us to turn our attention now to collecting information about learning in a classroom situation, a teaching and learning situation. Let's take a look at the following classroom situation. Take a minute and I'll go through it with you and we'll consider the features of performance that the teacher might monitor for in this situation. Let's take a look at the slide. The main lesson aim is to introduce and practice the past continuous versus past simple using when and while. You have a course book, your lesson plan, classroom activities, and you've planned some homework from the workbook. And the situation is, it's the middle of the lesson, your students have been introduced to the language structures and they're currently engaged in a speaking and listening activity, and they're telling a story using the past continuous and simple past. Now think about the sorts of features of performance that the teacher could monitor and evaluate. Let's take a look at some of those ideas. Timely feedback, let's have a look. So grammar structures, correct interaction, that's interesting. Speaking and listening skills, grammar, correct use of the forms. Very, very nice ideas there. Grammar, ability to apply the grammar accurately. Pronunciation, usage of tense. Okay. Tenses, presentation, exactly, speaking using the grammar. Those are all extremely valuable ideas. So let's have a look at some of the ideas we've identified. As we saw earlier in the LOA cycle, teachers can use the information gathered as they observe and monitor their learners' performance in the classroom. And they interpret their judgments, make decisions, and set in place plans of action for future progression. Plans for future progression for the short term, medium term and the long term are in fact core elements of the LOA cycle, with decisions and plans for the future. As such, the need emerges to set in place a structured record-keeping system. In-class tests can provide a very clear record of learners' performance on a given day. But what about the observations made by teachers in the classroom, as we've just been discussing? How can we know what our students have learned? How do we remember when we sit down to plan the next lesson? How do we check for it? And then what about the cover teacher who has to pick up and run from the point where you left off last lesson or maybe last week? In terms of memory, students can forget what they learned in the delay between this lesson and the next. And then, of course, do the teachers remember? How easy is it to remember where to pick up from? So we return to the notion in the LOA cycle of structured record keeping, making that transition from mental notes to formal records. Clearly, busy teachers with a lot of demands on their time, it's very difficult to keep up-to-date records of classroom activity. It's very, very challenging. I appreciate that. I wonder whether you have any ways in which you keep more structured records about your learners' performance and their progress. Maybe your institution has a formal record-keeping system. Please could you type in any ways in which you keep records for your learners' performance into the chat box now. And I'll just take a look as ideas are coming in. What do we mean by structured? It means a more formal type of record. So it's not something you've remembered, but something that's taken note of. So mentally, I'm afraid, consolidation, individualised records I'm seeing here, ad hoc notes. Okay, grade and evaluation sheets, spreadsheets. So a success chart or a journal. Very, very interesting concepts there. And your diary. Okay, some lovely ideas. A notebook for each class divided by day. That's excellent. And my records in capital letters. So clearly some very far-reaching ideas about that. Well, at Cambridge English, our research teams have been looking at some way into the future from the perspective of collecting classroom test data. And this is what we're envisaging. It's basically the same LOA diagram we saw earlier, but at the level of the classroom, we've embedded mini-E assessments with electronic record keeping by class and by individual learner. The teaching cycle begins, but within the cycle, a more systemised approach to the assessment of learners' development is embedded in the form of mini-E assessments. Now, this is mediated by a learning management system, or LMS. The mini-E assessment stimulates an electronic record-keeping system on the LMS. Students receive individualised feedback with recommendations directing them to support activities that relate to their test performance. These might be in the form of remedial, development or extension activities for our high-performing learners, depending on their performers. As the course progresses, an electronic student profile emerges in the form of an electronic portfolio. Formal e-records of achievement can be maintained for the individual learner and the whole class, and this in turn informs teacher planning, and then that feeds back into the teaching cycle. Well-designed LOA tests could be mapped into the learning programme and have the potential to provide invaluable insights about our learners' progress. And these can be stored in the student's portfolio. Of course, this is a vision of the future, and Cambridge English is very well placed, of course, to design, deliver and analyse tests that could then be mapped to a specifically designed learning programme. There are still many questions and areas to explore if we are to work out how we can capture other forms of more subjective data, such as teacher observation, as well as systemising the capture and analysis of more ephemeral subjective data, for example, speaking, listening, reading, writing. We are still in the early stages of LOA and working on the design of a range of LOA tools for teachers and learners. If any of you would like to explore LOA further, here are some links to useful articles and further reading. So to summarise in the webinar today, we've given you an overview of the concept of learning-oriented assessment. We've explored the key ideas underpinning the notion of learning-oriented assessment, which involves the collection and interpretation of evidence about performance so that decisions can be made to promote productive student learning with targeted learning pathways based on individual needs. We've looked at a model where student data can be captured electronically, generating timely and meaningful feedback for the learner with individualised recommendations for future learning and development. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar and found it useful. Okay, so welcome back. I'd like to introduce for the question and answer session Neil Jones.
Hello.
Who's very much our experienced assessment specialist, and he will be who works with me on the Learning Oriented Assessment project. So Neil, welcome.
Hi. Yes, Miranda, on this project, Miranda is our kind of learning interaction expert. Miranda recently completed an excellent PhD on using a learning management system to monitor and promote learner autonomy. So, and it's being published, so congratulations on that.
Thank you very much, Neil. It comes out in March.
Out in March.
Yes.
Watch the book stands.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm speaking much more from the assessment point of view. So that complementary.
Well, I have to say we've had some really interesting questions, and in fact the first one I'd like to look at is, can we say that LOA is learning while assessing? Well, that's a fantastic question. I'm thrilled that it's been asked, because in fact I would have to say that's precisely what we're trying to encourage, that it is learning while assessing. So yes, there's not much more to comment on that, because you've clearly embraced the comments that we've made on the webinar. The second question which we'd like to look at is somebody has asked whether there's any ideas on how to encourage teachers to make a written record of their class observations without special software. Neil, now you've joined me.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think, well, clearly the record and the nature of the record and how it is generated is a fundamental issue for the whole concept. The notion of learning-oriented assessment is about working with information, generating information from various sources and activities, and then being able to use that and feeding it back into learning in some positive way. And that implies some way of making a record, if it's a temporary or permanent one. I think there was a slide that asked you to contribute ideas on the kinds of activity that, what was the name of it? All the kinds of evidence. So what sort of activities would generate evidence? And there were lots of ideas came through, lots of classroom activities like role plays and
quizzes and all the usual things we do in classrooms.
I think to crack the issue of how we implement learning-oriented assessment in the classroom is really a question of looking at those tasks, the kind of tasks that one can do as learning exercises in the class, and an aspect of making them learning-oriented is how might they actually generate a record of some kind, something which almost self-generates. So I think the clever thinking has to go into how you remove the obligation from the teacher to make the complete record of what's happened. It has to be a kind of shared enterprise and somehow self-generating. We have proposed in the model that an E-assessment plays a role here. I wouldn't use the term E-assessment, just using IT, using digital technology to help generate the record. I'm sure that is part of the answer, but it's not simply a technical question. It is one of imagination. What kinds of learning activities provide evidence, and how can they actually help to generate the record?
And to add to that, in fact, Neil's absolutely right, and my interest is in learner autonomy, as Neil just explained. In fact, we do have, it's a shared enterprise between the teacher and the learner. So evidence of learning and written work, for example, has to come from the learner as well. And if you don't have a special software, of course there is such a thing, before we arrived at the idea of e-portfolios, of collecting student portfolios in the old-fashioned sense of collecting evidence of types of work where we can see how students are performing. And the students may be able to self-evaluate how they think they are performing. So it becomes an enterprise between the teacher and the learner in collecting evidence of work, not only the test data. Actually, I've noticed quite a few people on the screen talking about the Common European Framework, Neil, which is an area that I know that you're quite very strong on.
Okay, well, we have a question here, don't we?
Yes.
Do you use the Common European Framework with your mother tongue learners too, or only for foreigners? Well, it's a slightly different question, but let's put it to one side. No, the CEFR is definitely, it's a foreign language framework. It's an interesting question to think how you would like to extend it if you wanted to have a framework which included native speakers development as well as foreign language competence, and you'd think of various ways in which the experiences of learning as a native speaker differ from learning as a foreign language learner. So it is in its present form it's around foreign languages. But it's good to talk about the Common European Framework. Well, if you're like me, it is anyway. Because, in fact, there's another question further down that about validity, about how do we convince people that what we are proposing as learning-oriented assessment has validity. We always need models. We always need theory. And the model that the Common European Framework provides is very relevant to learning-oriented assessment. If you read the book, it presents a picture of a learner, a user, who has to address tasks that the real world throws up. In addressing those tasks, he engages in language activity, and that is a process which actually promotes learning as well as use, and engages his cognitive apparatus, where we think of the kind of cognitive skills for reading, listening, and also uh, um, strategies and knowledge of various kinds that are needed. So that's the model that the Common European Framework presents. It's very much the model that we've developed. We've given it, it's called a socio-cognitive model because it's cognition engaging with action in society. That's the model that we base our exams on, and we validate our exams in terms of by asking the question, does what we ask students to do in the exam, does that relate closely to what they would do in the real world? And of course, exams aren't the real world, but the interaction, the engagement with a task can be authentic. It can be the same in the test task as in the real world task, and also we have the classroom tasks. So the task is at the centre. This is it turned into a lecture, sorry, but it's the task which is at the centre of learning-oriented assessment. There's a test task, a learning task, a task in the real world.
Yeah. In fact, just to finish that notion, the Common European Framework have identified the idea of an e-portfolio. And in fact, if you were to look at their website, you may find some information about portfolios. And that's something that maybe is relevant to our learning-oriented assessment model as well. I think that's probably all that we've got time for, and I know there were lots more questions, and I apologise we weren't able to answer all of them. However, thank you very, very much for attending today, and remember that there is a forum where you can post any further questions you have after this webinar. We look forward to seeing you at our future webinars, and the next webinar is on Cambridge English Advanced Writing. Thank you very much for coming, and goodbye.